That morning, I was standing in the kitchen, holding my baby in my arms. The incision from my C-section still hurt every time I turned my body. My husband walked out, looked around the house and asked, "Why is the house still such a mess?" I had been up almost all night. I cannot remember the last time I slept all the way through. But what made me freeze was not that question. It was what he said right after, "You are home all day." He said it very calmly, not angry, not harsh. Just like he was reminding me of a simple fact, and in that moment, I began to doubt myself. Maybe I really was weak. Maybe taking care of a baby all day could not possibly be that exhausting. Maybe I was overreacting. It took me months to understand that I was not weak. I was slowly disappearing inside a marriage that looked perfectly fine from the outside. And that was when things started to shift. To understand why that sentence hit me the way it did, you have to go back. I used to believe I had a stable marriage, not the kind of glowing happiness you see in movies, but good enough that no one had to worry. From the outside, we were a very typical middle-class American couple. A tidy house, a steady routine, no loud arguments, no dramatic scenes that made people curious. Everything looked like a family running the way it should, and for a long time, I believed that too. My husband worked full-time with almost absolute fixed hours. He left the house on time in the morning, came home on time in the evening, and rarely shifted his schedule on weekends. He lived by discipline, and to him, that discipline was the sign of a responsible man. His days were divided into clear time blocks, as if as long as everything stayed on schedule, life would automatically be fine. To him, a good day was a day when nothing ran late. Dinner in our house always happened at a set time. Not because we were starving, but because to him, dinner on time was proof that the family was still steady. When we sat down at the table right on schedule, he felt relieved, like he had just checked off an important item on his list of responsibilities. I used to think it was just a habit. Later, I realized it was how he measured the stability of our marriage. He would say it simply, "I provide. That is my role." To him, going to work, bringing money home, making sure the family lacked nothing materially was the most important part. I did not argue with that. I was even grateful. I believed each person had a role, and if everyone fulfilled their role, the family would be fine. I was pregnant during that time. My body began to change. My pace slowed down, but I still tried to keep everything the same. I still handled most of the housework, still tried to have dinner ready on time, still tried not to let his life be disrupted. Not because I felt strong, but because I did not want to be the reason things drifted off the stable track he believed was so important. I thought that if I just tried a little harder, everything would fall back into place. During the pregnancy, my husband began saying things that at first I did not consider serious. "You are too sensitive. Everyone is tired when they are pregnant. I cannot take time off work just because you are upset." He did not say those things in anger, and he did not say them in a harsh tone. He said them calmly, logically, as if he were stating an obvious truth I should understand. And I tried to understand. I tried to convince myself that maybe he was right, that maybe I was overreacting, that everyone gets tired during pregnancy, and that my emotions were not something that should interrupt his work or his schedule. No one would have called it abuse. Not even me at the time. There was no yelling, no rough behavior, no sign that anyone needed to step in. Everything felt quiet, reasonable, easy to accept. But there was one thing I slowly began to realize, quietly and gradually. Everything that mattered to me was placed in the category of not serious enough. My exhaustion was not serious enough for him to slow down. My worries were not important enough to adjust his schedule. The nights I lay awake were not significant enough to disrupt a morning that ran on time. Our marriage was still called stable. The stability just depended on everything around him staying on schedule. As for me, I slowly learned to make myself smaller so I could fit into someone else's timetable and rhythm. Looking back, I understand that was when I began to disappear inside the marriage I once believed was safe. If you have ever lived in a marriage that looked perfectly fine from the outside, but on the inside, you were always the one trying a little harder to keep things from slipping, you are not the only one. I had a C-section. There were no unusual complications. The doctor followed procedure, the nurses were professional, everything happened the way people call safe. When I was wheeled out of the operating room, I carried an incision that still hurt, a body completely drained, and a newborn entirely dependent on me. I remember that feeling clearly, relief that my baby was born safely, and at the same time a sense of being overwhelmed because I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be simple again. The first days after delivery passed in a state I did not know how to name. My incision hurt every time I moved, hurt enough that even sitting up required mental preparation. I was continuously sleep deprived, not just one night, but many nights in a row, sleep broken into short fragments. The baby needed to be fed, changed, held, soothed, with almost no concept of day or night. Time was no longer measured in hours, but in the number of times my baby cried and the number of times I forced myself to stand up even though my body had not recovered. When we came home, everything became quieter, but not in a comforting way. It was the quiet of a house where all responsibility had shifted to one side. I stayed home with an incision that still hurt, with a body that had not adjusted, with a baby who needed constant care. I learned how to hold my baby without pressing against the incision, learned how to move slowly so I would not hurt more, learned how to eat a few quick bites when I could, because I did not know when the baby would cry again. My husband returned to work very quickly, so quickly that I barely registered the transition. He went back to his usual schedule, leaving the house on time in the morning, coming home on time in the evening, as if everything was gradually returning to normal. To him, going back to work was a sign that life was stabilizing, that we had moved past the initial difficult stage. He believed that as long as he kept going to work and kept bringing money home, he was fulfilling his responsibility. He did not say it to justify himself, but as an obvious truth. He went to work, which meant he was carrying the family. He did not leave, did not avoid, did not disappear in a physical sense. He came home every day, slept in the same bed, was present in the same space, but his presence stopped there. He was not present in the nights when I sat holding our baby with burning eyes from exhaustion. He was not present when I froze in the middle of the room because my incision throbbed. He was not present in the confusion of a first-time mother trying to understand what her baby needed and whether she was doing it right. He believed he had fulfilled his responsibility because he went to work every day. I began to understand that responsibility can be defined very differently depending on who is speaking. To him, responsibility meant money, bills being paid, keeping everything from falling apart materially. To me, at that time, responsibility was every time I stood up despite the pain, every time I rocked the baby to sleep when my eyelids would barely stay open, every time I told myself I had to be okay because there was no one else there. No one hit me. No one walked away. There was no dramatic moment I could point to and say, this is when everything collapsed. Everything happened quietly. My husband did nothing that society would clearly label wrong. He just was not present where I needed him most, and that was much harder to name than obvious mistakes. My postpartum days moved in a rhythm that was monotonous and exhausting. I cared for the baby. I endured the pain. I stayed sleep-deprived. He continued to believe that as long as he went to work, everything would work itself out. I do not know when it happened, but I began to understand that his disappearance was not an action. It was a state. He was there, but he was not with me. And that exhausted me more than the incision and the sleepless nights. After giving birth, I was home all day, not resting, just living inside a stretch of time with no clear boundaries. Day and night blurred together. I stayed up alone at night, dozing off for a few minutes only to wake up again to crying. I held my baby with an incision that had not healed. Turning too quickly sent a sharp pain through me. I ate quickly when I could. Showered fast when the baby slept. Everything repeated, with no clear beginning and no clear end. My time was not measured in hours, but in the number of times my baby cried and the number of times I had to stand up, even though my body had not recovered. I was home all day, but there was never a moment when I was truly still. My husband still came home on time. He ate dinner. He slept. His rhythm did not change. His life had order. Mine did not. The next morning, before leaving for work, he looked around the house and asked why it was messy. His tone was normal, like an objective observation. I stood there, holding the baby, still exhausted. He did not ask how long I had slept. He did not ask if the baby had been fussy overnight. He only asked why I was always tired. To him, being home all day meant having time. And if you have time, there is no reason to be tired. I realized that in his view, what I did not count as work. Housework and childcare were not on the list of things that justified exhaustion. To him, tired meant deadlines, rush hour traffic, working all day. As for me, I was just at home. I was not only tired from lack of sleep or from pain, I was tired from the feeling that my effort did not count, tired from having to explain something that should have been obvious. He did not hit me, he did not leave, he was still on time, still believed he was fulfilling his role. And every morning, he looked at the house before he looked at me. There were no big fights, no explosions, just the same question repeated and the same feeling that what I was doing was not considered real. And in that silence, I began to understand that many women are living in houses that run on time, but no one asks how tired they really are. When I was already exhausted, my husband began saying things that sounded familiar, so familiar that at the time I did not see them as dangerous. He did not raise his voice, did not snap. He spoke calmly, as if he were making reasonable observations, and that calmness made it harder for me to push back. There were moments when I said I was tired, not to complain, just because I truly was tired. Tired from lack of sleep, tired from pain, tired from not having a single quiet space to myself all day. He would listen and respond immediately. He was tired too. That sentence placed his feelings next to mine, but in a way that made his exhaustion seem more legitimate. He was tired from working all day, from his job, from responsibility, and me, I was just at home. After those conversations, I began to ask myself whether I was overreacting, whether staying home with a baby all day could really be that exhausting, whether I was making everything bigger than it was. I did not argue. I just went quiet, and in that silence, I started doubting my own feelings. Another time, when I said I had not managed to get anything done that day, he looked at me and said, "You are home all day." He said it lightly, almost like an objective remark, but inside that sentence was a clear assumption that being home all day meant having time. And if you have time, there is no reason for things to be unfinished. He did not ask what my day had actually looked like. He did not ask how many times I had gotten up, how much I had slept. He looked at the house, looked at me, and reached a conclusion. When I tried to explain, not to argue, just to be understood, he would respond with another sentence. I did not do anything wrong. That statement felt like a period at the end of the conversation. If he was not wrong, then the problem was not him. And if the problem was not him, then maybe it was me. I began adjusting myself, trying to talk less, complain less, show less that I was overwhelmed. There were times when I stopped talking altogether and just cried. I cried because I was tired, because I felt small, because I was trying to explain something that felt obvious and still was not understood. When I cried, he would look at me with irritation and say, "You are overreacting." He did not shout, but it was enough to make me feel ashamed of my own emotions, as if my tears were excessive, unnecessary. Another time, when I tried to say I was not okay, he sighed and said, "Do not turn this into drama." Drama was something no one wanted to deal with, and I did not want to be the woman creating drama in my own marriage. So I went quiet. From then on, I learned to swallow my feelings. I learned to say I was fine, even when I was not. I learned to smile so everything would look lighter. His words did not hurt me all at once. They made me question myself. I started wondering whether I was truly exhausted or just weak, whether what I felt was worth saying out loud. None of the sentences he used were obvious insults. None of them sounded like violence, but repeated over time, they created something very real. I slowly lost trust in my own perception. I was no longer sure whether what I was experiencing was real, or just something I was overthinking. Later, when I heard people call it gaslighting, I understood why so many women recognize themselves in those words. They do not knock you down immediately. They make you doubt yourself, shrink yourself, and keep enduring in silence. And by the time I understood that, I was already too exhausted to even name it. I began to lose sleep. Not the usual kind of trouble sleeping, but the kind where my body and mind never fully shut down. When the baby slept, I could not. The moment I drifted off, I would jolt awake at the smallest sound, out of fear I had overslept, out of the constant sense that I had to stay ready. Those nights blurred together with no pause, and I slowly stopped remembering the last time I had slept through the night. Along with the insomnia came a heavy feeling of uselessness. I was home all day, yet I constantly felt like I had not done enough. The house was still messy. I was still tired. The baby was still crying. I looked around and saw no evidence that I was doing well. I started wondering whether I was even suited for this role. A good mother should be able to manage everything. I could not. I began blaming myself more and more. Blaming myself for being weak, for not handling the pressure, for thinking that giving birth was just something you pushed through and then life went back to normal. I did not say those thoughts out loud, but they were there, repeating in my head, especially during the long nights when everything was quiet and I had nothing left to do but think. I was not comforted, not because no one noticed I was struggling, but because my emotions were not treated as a problem that needed to be addressed. When I said I was not okay, I got a short reply. Hang in there. It sounded like encouragement, but it came without presence or practical support. It felt more like a directive than shared understanding. Hang in there meant handle it yourself, and it will sort itself out. So I hung in there. I forced myself to get up each morning without enough sleep. I cared for the baby, even when my body felt drained. I tried to keep everything looking normal, because I did not want to be the one making things heavier. But the more I tried, the more I felt myself slipping. I no longer recognized who I was. I could not remember what it felt like to be comfortable in my own body. My husband could not name the problem. He looked at me and did not see someone struggling with depression. He saw changes he did not understand. I was sadder, quieter, easier to cry. To him, those were not signs of something that required attention. They were just temporary mood changes. He called it mood swings, a word that sounded light, a word that made everything simpler. Mood swings meant it would pass. It meant there was no need to pause, no need to change anything, no need to do anything differently. Mood swings meant my emotions were something that appeared on their own and would disappear on their own. When he called it mood swings, I started doubting myself. Maybe I was just too sensitive. Maybe my hormones were not balanced yet. Maybe I just needed time. I began telling myself not to make it into something bigger, that many other women go through this, that I should handle it better. But while I tried to convince myself of that, the emptiness inside me grew clearer. I no longer felt joy even in moments that were supposed to be joyful. I took care of my baby, but I did not feel the connection I thought I would. I completed each task mechanically, like I was moving through a checklist, without emotion attached. I did not collapse. I still got up every day, still cared for my baby, still did what needed to be done. But inside, I was pulling back little by little. I made myself smaller so I would not be a burden. I stayed quiet so I would not be accused of overreacting. I learned how to exist in a state where my feelings were not considered significant. No one said I had a problem. No one said I needed help. No one named what was happening. And because no name was given, I started believing maybe it was not serious enough to acknowledge. Maybe I just needed to try a little harder. Later, when I looked back, I understood that the most dangerous thing was not postpartum depression itself. The most dangerous thing was when it was called something else, something lighter, something harmless, making the person living through it believe she just had to endure and it would pass. And while I was trying to endure, I lost so much energy simply surviving without being seen. I did not argue. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I realized that every time I opened my mouth, everything circled back to the same place. I did not demand, not because I did not need help, but because I understood that what I needed was not something he was willing to give. I did not beg either. I moved through that stage quickly, faster than I expected. Sometimes people stop not because they have been heard, but because they understand there will not be a different answer. I chose silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from anger, but the kind that pulls inward. I shortened my words. I stopped explaining. I no longer tried to prove that I was exhausted, overwhelmed, in need of being seen. I let questions pass without responding. I stopped expecting him to notice something he had never tried to see. That withdrawal was not loud. There were no clear signs. I was still there, still doing what needed to be done, still keeping the house running. But inside, I had stopped in a very different place. I no longer expected change. I no longer waited for the right words at the right time. I no longer believed that saying it one more time would make things different. Instead of continuing to spin in the same space, I quietly turned somewhere else. I asked my side of the family for help. Not as a cry for rescue, but in short and practical sentences. I need a little help. I am tired. I cannot keep up. I said those words to my mother and to my sisters. No long explanations, no justification, just saying it was enough. My mother did not ask how hard I had tried. My sisters did not ask why I could not handle it on my own. They just showed up. No judgment. No demands that I be stronger. No promises that everything would be fine. They did concrete things. The same things I had been doing alone for too long. And in those ordinary tasks, I felt part of the weight being shared. I did not turn it into an argument. I did what needed to be done. When someone is not present enough, the empty space gets filled by someone else. Not to fight anyone, just to keep from collapsing. Not to create conflict, but to fill what is missing. I did not do it to prove anything. I did it to survive. I did not need anyone to take my side in a debate. I needed hands that showed up at the right time. That help did not make me weaker. It steadied me. When I no longer had to explain my emotions, I began to breathe more easily. When I no longer had to ask permission to be tired, I began to sleep more. When I stopped waiting for recognition from someone who could not see, I began to see myself again. I realized that pulling back was not giving up. Pulling back was resetting boundaries. I did not shout to be noticed. I did not slam my hand on the table to be heard. I simply stopped pouring my energy into a place where there was no response. It was not one dramatic decision. It was a series of small choices, repeated every day. I did not announce it. I did not ask for permission. I adjusted my life in the way I needed to. I did not turn it into a statement. I just did what had to be done to keep things moving. And in that process, I saw something clearly. I was no longer standing in a place of waiting. I had stepped into a place where I took care of myself in whatever way I could. My pulling back did not make the house collapse. It changed the way I existed inside it. I spoke less, explained less, tried less to be understood, and in return, I had more quiet space to recover. I did not fall apart. I did not fight. I chose a quieter path with structure, one where I leaned on people who were willing to show up. To some people, it might have looked like avoidance. To me, it was the only way to protect the part of myself that was still intact. When I stopped arguing, stopped demanding, stopped begging, I also stopped being pulled into the same old cycles. I pulled back so I could stand steady, and that was the first step toward a change I did not yet have a name for, but I could already feel it beginning. I started therapy, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I needed a place where my emotions were treated as valid data. Therapy did not fix everything in one session. It gave me a place where I could finish a sentence without being corrected halfway through. It created a quiet enough space for me to speak without being interrupted. For the first time in a long while, I did not have to justify why I was tired or why I was sad. I simply said it, and that alone was a change. Session by session, I began to understand basic truths. I was not weak. I had been enduring too long in a rhythm that was not built for me. I had not failed as a mother or as a wife. I had been left alone at the moments when presence mattered most. Once the problem had a name, the shame inside me began to shrink. I no longer had to ask myself whether I was overreacting. That awareness did not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It came slowly, steadily, and practically. I learned to separate emotion from fact. I learned that my exhaustion was not proof of weakness. It was the result of one person carrying too much alone. It sounds simple, but at the time it was a major shift. At the same time, I began relearning skills I had let go of. Not grand skills, just everyday ones. How to organize my time around my own rhythm. How to set boundaries for my energy. How to say no without apologizing. I realized I had become so used to adapting to someone else that I had forgotten I had the right to design a day that fit me. I started working again in more flexible ways. Remote work, freelance, part-time. Not to prove I could do everything, but to build a stable and self-directed source of income. The work was not loud, it did not come with big titles, but it gave me the feeling of standing on my own 2 feet. That was a feeling I had been missing for a long time. Once I had my own income, I separated finances. Not in a confrontational way, but in a clear way. I needed to know what I had, what I controlled, and what I depended on. It did not break the family apart. It made things more transparent, and that transparency made me much calmer. I did not tell anyone this was a big plan. I was not thinking about revenge. I was focused on recovery, thinking more clearly, working more steadily. Each step was small, but together they formed a very concrete path. I was no longer reacting. I was becoming intentional. There was a subtle shift I began to notice. I no longer needed validation to feel valuable. I stopped waiting for someone to acknowledge that I had tried hard enough. Once I knew I was not weak, and I knew I had been left alone, I no longer needed to prove that to anyone. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about not breaking again. But as I grew stronger, clearer, and more independent, I realized I was no longer in a vulnerable position. The truth is, during that phase, I was not thinking about revenge at all. I was thinking about how not to break. And that focus on recovery changed my position. As I became stronger, clearer, and more independent, every decision that followed became far more grounded. I did not turn into someone new. I returned to the version of myself that had been worn down for too long. Therapy did not make me perfect. Flexible work did not solve everything. Separating finances was not a dramatic declaration. But together, those steps built a new foundation. A foundation where I could stand steady and look at everything with clarity. And once I was steady again, I understood something clearly. Whatever happened next, I would not walk into it from a place of exhaustion. I had recovered enough to choose. And that alone was a bigger change than any promise. I did not give notice. Not because I wanted to surprise anyone, but because I understood something clearly. When you are still rebuilding your balance, announcing a plan only makes things messier. I did not need an argument. I did not need to persuade anyone. I needed to make sure that when I stepped into the next phase, I would not enter it empty-handed. I began documenting how I cared for our child, not emotionally, but practically. Schedules. Who took the baby to appointments, who stayed home when the baby was sick, who handled the night wakings, who organized the calendar. I did not do it with confrontation in mind. I did it because I understood that in major decisions, emotions are not enough. Facts are what get seen. I kept medical records, paperwork from the birth, follow-up visits, notes about my child's health. I did not gather everything in one dramatic sweep. I kept it consistently, in order. The same way I was rebuilding the foundation of my life. No drama, no tension, just necessary preparation. At the same time, I made sure my income was stable enough. Not impressive, just sufficient. Enough so I did not have to ask permission to take my child to the doctor. Enough so I did not have to justify daily decisions. That stability did not happen overnight. It came from small choices I had already begun making, step by step. I was not hiding what I was doing. I simply was not announcing it. I did not say I was preparing for divorce. I did not use big words. On the outside, life looked normal. Inside, I was repositioning myself, not as someone dependent, but as a mother capable of standing on her own. My goal was clear: custody and autonomy. I did not want to take my child away from anyone. I did not want to turn my child into part of a conflict. I wanted to show that I was a capable, independent parent, that I understood my child, that I cared for my child, that I could organize a stable daily life. It sounds rational, and it was. But reaching that rational place required surviving a long stretch of exhaustion. I did not want any future decision made from that state. So I prepared while I was still clear-headed. I did not wait for everything to fall apart before I started gathering pieces. During that time, I spoke less, I observed. I recorded. I kept my routine steady. I did not rush. I understood that rushed steps leave unnecessary traces. I wanted everything clear, clean, and by the book. That was the only way to protect myself and my child in a system that runs on documentation and evidence. I understood something very clearly. In major decisions, tears have no legal value. Records do. It does not come down to who loves a child more. It comes down to who has done what, who can continue doing it, and who offers greater stability. I did not try to tell my story. I let the facts speak. I did not picture a battle. I did not imagine dramatic confrontations. I pictured an ordinary morning, taking my child to school, going to work, coming home to a life that did not require permission. That image was clear enough to tell me I was moving in the right direction. Preparing for divorce did not make me cold, it made me focused. I was no longer pulled up and down by emotion. I no longer reacted to words. I focused on what I could control. Time, records, income, my child's health. Those things formed a structure strong enough to steady me. I was not preparing for a fight. I was preparing for a process. I saw it as a demonstration. Proof that I was capable. Proof that I had been present. Proof that I could continue being present in a stable way. And once that preparation was complete, I knew that whatever decision came next would not be made in panic. I had not yet stepped out of the marriage, but I was already standing at the door. Not to run, to walk out on my own feet. And that alone changed how I saw my future, and my child's. When I officially entered the divorce process, my husband was shocked. He looked at me and said, a sentence I later realized is very familiar to many men in that situation. He thought everything was fine. That statement was not an accusation, and it was not an apology. It sounded like genuine surprise, as if our shared life had been running smoothly enough for him to believe nothing serious was happening. I did not argue with that statement. I did not try to explain why things were not fine. I understood that if he was still surprised at that point, then any explanation would only repeat what I had already said before and had not been heard. So I did not recount my feelings. I did not bring up the sleepless nights. I did not mention the exhaustion. I did not mention the feeling of being left alone. I had already moved past the stage of needing to be understood. I let the lawyer and the paperwork speak, not because I was emotionless, but because I knew this was the only language that would be heard at that stage. I did not carry my personal story into the courtroom. I carried facts, schedules, medical records, specific documentation of daily childcare. I did not need to turn it into a speech. I only needed it to exist in the right place. Throughout the entire process, I remained very calm, not because I no longer had emotions, but because I no longer placed emotions on the scale. I did not need the court to recognize my pain. I needed the court to see reality, and that reality was not in words, it was in who had shown up every single day. My lawyer made it very clear, the court does not read pain. The court reads calendars, records, and presence. Who knows the doctor appointments? Who is there when the child needs them? Who organizes daily life? And who only provides money? Providing money is not wrong, but providing money is not the same as nurturing. Those two things are not the same, and in the legal system, that difference is very clear. I did not say I was a good mother. I showed what I had done each day. I did not need to prove it with words. What I had done over time formed a complete picture on its own. I did not describe my sacrifices. I showed what I had done, and that was enough. My husband did not understand how everything had reached this point. I knew that. But I also knew that his lack of understanding was no longer my responsibility. I did not need him to understand for the process to move forward correctly. I only needed everything placed in its proper position. And once everything was placed where it belonged, the outcome became very clear. My divorce was not loud. There were no tense confrontations, no back and forth arguments. It unfolded according to procedure, proper paperwork, proper process. And that order highlighted the difference between feeling stable and being truly stable. There was a moment when I saw this very clearly, when everything had been said, not by my voice, but by the records. I did not feel relief in a winning or losing sense, I only felt that I had not entered this divorce in a state of panic. I entered it prepared, and that created a very significant difference. I did not celebrate. I did not grieve the way people often expect. I only felt that everything had been called by its correct name. What I had once carried alone was now seen in the right way, not through sympathy, but through factual acknowledgement. When my husband said he thought everything was fine, I did not argue, because I understood that fine, in his mind, simply meant nothing, disrupted his routine. For me, fine meant a place where both people were seen, and when that did not exist, ending things quietly was the most reasonable choice. My divorce ended without noise, but it closed a chapter where silence had lasted far too long. And this time, the silence was no longer endurance. It was the result of everything finally being placed exactly where it belonged. I recovered from depression not in a sudden awakening, but through a steady series of days where I slept more, thought more clearly, and no longer had to ask myself each morning whether I was doing something wrong. My life did not become perfect, it simply became mine. I have my own rhythm, work that fits me, and quiet stretches of time that require no explanation to anyone. My child is stable. That is what matters most. My child has a consistent routine, consistent care, and the sense of safety children always need. I do not try to create the image of an ideal family. I simply keep my child's life simple and clear enough that they do not have to guess who will be there today. This change was not loud. There was no dramatic reversal, no declaration of victory, but it was clear enough to create a wide distance between before and now. I am no longer in survival mode. I am living. My husband is different. He lost his family, not because someone took it from him, but because he was no longer in it. He watched everything unfold and did not understand where he had gone wrong. He could not point to a decisive moment, because in truth there was no single moment. There were only many times he was not present, and when added together, the absence became too large. I did not hurt him all at once. I simply stopped filling the gaps he no longer saw. I did not hurt him immediately. I did not cause him to collapse in front of everyone. I only let him understand too late that there are things money cannot buy back and cannot be repaired with a final explanation. I do not need to prove that I was right. Life does that on its own. I did not go back to confront him. I did not stand in front of him and say that he had done this to me. I did not list what I endured. I did not need him to admit anything. I had already moved past that stage. Words like that were no longer necessary. If there is one sentence I say, it is to myself. I made it through. Not in a heroic way, just in a very practical way. I did not break. Not in a heroic way, but in a very practical one. I went through a period where I was not seen, not named, not supported properly, and I did not break. That sentence is not an accusation. It is not bragging. It is simply a fact. I survived, and from there, I rebuilt my life in a way that no longer depends on whether someone understands me or not. When everything settled, I did not try to draw lessons for others. I do not preach. I do not say who was right or wrong. I simply leave a space for the listener to see themselves in it. How many people are in marriages that look fine, but are really just running on habit? How many people think providing money is enough? That responsibility ends with work hours and bills. I do not need the answer, because those who have stood in a house like mine will recognize themselves, and those who have not may understand later the way my husband did. Not because someone told them, but because some things only become clear when they are no longer there. My story does not end with an explosion. It ends with a very different kind of silence. No longer the silence of endurance, but the silence of someone who has made it through, who stands steady, and no longer needs to shout to be seen. Some marriages do not fall apart because of betrayal, but because one person slowly disappears inside their own home. When emotions are repeatedly dismissed as overreacting, people stop arguing. They shrink, and one day, they stand up in silence. If you have ever felt exhausted and no one asked why, you are not weak. You have simply tried for too long. If stories like this resonate with you, stay with me. Here, we call things by their real names. The things people often pretend are still fine.